Studies have shown that birds experience REM sleep much as mammals do, which suggests that they dream. The great auk, Penguinus impennis, is driven to extinction in the modern era by Europeans who hunt and kill the bird for its down, used to make pillows. The bird's demise is hastened further by its own increasing rarity, as museums and collectors are willing to pay enticing sums for specimens, money that proves irresistible to poor fishers and sheep herders. The very last colony of great auks survives until the middle of the 19th century on the nearly inaccessible island of Elde, off the coast of Iceland. On July 3, 1844, three men sent in search of great auks by a wealthy collector find what is possibly the very last breeding pair of great auks in the world, incubating a single egg. One of the men, Sigurður Isleifsson, later described what took place. The rocks were covered with blackbirds, and then we saw the Geirfugl, which is the Icelandic word for the auks. They walked slowly. Jon Branson crept up with his arms open. The bird that Jon got went into a corner, but mine was going to the edge of the cliff. It walked like a man, but moved its feet quickly. I caught it close to the edge, a precipice many fathoms deep. Its wings lay close to the sides, not hanging out. I took him by the neck, and he flapped his wings. He made no cry. I strangled him. The third man, Ketil Ketilsson, finds the nest, and acting on a familiar human impulse that has yet to be fully understood, he smashes the egg with his boot. That night, he and his companions return home from their long, exhausting day and fall asleep quickly, their heads filling with phantom people and scenes that vanish into nothingness and are left unrecorded when they wake. From this night on, there are no more great auk dreams.
Wow. Um, just to jump in, I know from just what you said that you were having prior to getting into the book just more of a relationship with birds, and you can see that just from the start of the cover, but also throughout the book. I'm curious, even beyond that, just because the book really centers in on ecosystems and our environment and the people that inhabit that, not just humans, but animals. But I'm curious to know what your relationship is like with animals as a whole, if it maybe just more so stem from birds. And again, not to dive so quickly right in, but just what your thoughts are just on environmental matters in terms of
Sure.
animals and protection.
Sure. Well, I guess I'd say I've always been fascinated by the fact that we are animals, right? Human beings are animals. And for such a long time, we've had this idea that we're somehow exceptional and set apart from everything else that lives, right? But it's, the more I think about it, the more I study it, the more I write about these things, the more I feel kind of a kinship with other animals. We see the world through animal eyes. We hear the world through animal ears. We're a member of a particular species in a particular genus and so on. And I think that's really the key to us finding a way to live in a sustainable way on this planet is to acknowledge our connection with all of these other creatures who are much more like us than we probably want to admit. So, yeah, it's always been a kind of a fascination of mine. I've always been interested in animals. Um, you know, uh, Pets, of course, are a way that kids usually first encounter animals. I had some rabbits when I was a kid and looked after them, and then a dog broke into the rabbit hutch and killed the rabbits, and it was, pretty traumatic. But it kind of showed me something about the natural world that really kind of stuck in my head, and I wanted to explore it further in books. And so, it's always been a part of what I've written, but it really came out fully, these questions and these thoughts and ideas in this latest book, The Book of Rain.
Amazing. And then one thing I also wanted to touch on, just with again that environment, we see the natural elements, and then we also see natural incidents. So getting into the ghost ore, of it
Mm.
all. So maybe for those who haven't gotten the chance to read the book, if you wanted to describe what ghost ore is, and just with my research, I know that you were inspired from Fort McMurray and the bitumen that was there. So I'm
Mhm.
curious if that was something that you were familiar with before and really wanted to incorporate into the book, or if that was something that kind of just came along as you were writing.
Hmm. Thanks. Yeah. Um, yeah. I knew I wanted to write, set this book in Alberta, and I wanted to write about the resource industries that we have here. I grew up in Grand Prairie, which was also an oil and gas boom town, like Fort McMurray. Not quite as completely tied to the oil sands as Fort McMurray is, but still, very much in that sort of resource kind of way of life. And when I initially started writing this book, I thought I was going to write about Fort McMurray itself. And my inspiration for the catastrophe that happens in the novel was the big fire in Fort McMurray a few years back there. But as I started to work on that, I realized I've never lived in Fort McMurray. It's not my town. I've never worked in the oil sands. I've talked to lots of people who have, but I just felt like, well, this isn't really my this isn't my story to tell or my story to write about. So usually when that happens to me as a writer, I decide, well, I'll just make up my own version of it. So that's what I did. I decided to invent a fictional ore, and I called it ghost ore. And it is based on bitumen for sure, and the town of River Meadows is based on places like Grand Prairie and Fort McMurray. But making it a fictional or just gave me the freedom to tell the story I wanted to tell in a kind of fabulous magical way rather than sticking to the facts exactly, because what I wanted to say was something more, suggestive than just outright direct. And so that's where ghost ore comes from. It in the novel it causes strange effects on the people who live there, hallucinations, strange shifts in space and time. And, in a way, I think that's a way of me. That's a way that I'm approaching the metaphorically approaching the idea that these incredible resources that make so much money, they do kind of warp our mind and warp our thinking and get people thinking profit over everything else, right? So I think that's how the fantastical element of the book is linked to the real world.
And again, that parallel where you see people going to River Meadows, especially our main characters, Amery and Alex, their father, going
Mhm.
and going into the mines and yeah, it's a scary substance. When I remember in the beginning, I was like, oh my goodness, like just I think you do a good job at really putting the reader into that
Yeah.
world.
Hmm.
Um, but to your point, there, as fictional as it may be, there's a lot of reality in just the overall coreness of it. So
Hmm.
it's scary, but it's true.
Yeah, and I think that's like any of these substances, like bitumen. It is a scary substance. It's so powerful and so toxic that digging it up out of the ground and making use of it makes us rich and fills our cities full of energy and that's wonderful. But the other side of it is pretty scary, as we know, right? As we know.
hmm And you also see, just going off into, I think, a theme that we also see throughout the book, natural incidents versus kind of man-made destruction,
Mhm.
and us trying to tackle these situations. Are we making it worse? Are we creating the problem? Are we the problem? So
Mhm.
you really see that throughout. And again, I also wanted to know, was that also something that you wanted to explore right off the bat? Or again, did you find that that was also coming out? Because yeah, I think at first you're seeing the substance, but then
Mhm.
later on you're seeing, especially with the animals again that are involved. Yeah, it's again, it's like who's the problem?
Yeah. Yeah, there's this down the road from where I live. I live in an acreage neighborhood that's lots of trees, and one of the properties, the house was burned down and the people had to leave. So the property was just sort of closed off, and nobody was supposed to go in there. And it was all overgrown. And I couldn't resist going in there and exploring this place because it fascinated me, the idea of a place that people had inhabited and people had turned into a place to live and work and et cetera, et cetera. And then nature was taking it back, right? Nature was taking this place back. And we see that in some of the places around the world where disasters have happened because of environmental catastrophes caused by humans, like Chernobyl, for example, or Fukushima in Japan. And the part of it that just really, gets my imagination is going is the idea that some place has to be left because it's become too dangerous for people. But then animals move in, and trees and plants and flowers, and somehow they find a way to thrive in these places that we can't live in. And that's it, kind of scary and wonderful at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because again, I think as humans and society, we're always trying to evolve. We're always trying to see what the greater thing is, what we a different way to look at something. But
Hmm.
in what sense do we take a step back where it's like, okay, again, animals are able to again re-enter that and make it work. What are we not getting? Or again, are we not
Hmm.
looking at ourselves? So
Yeah.
again, I found that really interesting to just you see that balance between nature versus human. And
Mhm.
again, with that thread of just, all being beings. So not just humans, but the animals, the earth, everything that's centered around that. So again, I just really enjoyed the way that you tied that in all together.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, so I wanted to circle back to Alex and Amory. So siblings again who went to River Meadows with their family as their father was having a job there, and then we see different periods throughout their life. I wonder what you wanted readers to get out of those characters, and particularly the relationship that they have.
Hmm. It's kind of hard to answer that question because they sort of evolved organically, right? I had the idea of a family moving to this new town, and it's a place that's unfamiliar to them, and that's kind of based on my own background, my own history to some extent. And just because it was a family, there was a mother and father and a son and a daughter, and they were the core characters. So, Alex and Amory evolved out of that. Uh, but they kind of, well, they really go their own separate ways, right? They go separate ways in terms of their life and what matters to them. And Amory becomes very much involved with trying to help the animals who are trapped in this forbidden zone, this where this the catastrophe happened. Um, that's not so much based on my own life, but the idea of the way that siblings can be so different from each other, growing up in the same house, same family, and yet, they've all got their own interests and their own way of seeing the world, and they go on such different paths. That's always been really fascinating to me. I especially being the one in the one member of my family who just loved books and loved reading and writing, and where did that come from? I don't know. It's kind of a mystery, and I guess that's the way Amory is to Alex in the book. She's kind of a mystery. How did she end up becoming who she is? And part of his, well, later on in the book, he tries to find her. She's lost in this forbidden zone, and he tries to find her. And I think he's trying to figure out who the heck she is, right? Who the heck she was and who she is, and understand her better.
Hmm. Hmm. We also get to know Claire as well, and Claire, I found for me personally the most fascinating
Hmm.
person in the book, but I found her story to be very heartbreaking.
Mm.
And you see how you see kind of her story from when she was younger and really being put in very difficult situations, and see how it's really had her independent, made her more independent, but also isolated.
Mhm.
And you see her again going into life more in like the trafficking of the animals. Um, so yeah, she for me at least was someone that I feel I always felt for, and I just found was so interesting because of her story from
Hmm.
the past and really seeing how her past has shaped who she is. So I found her character as a whole very interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. She came out of my desire to create a character who, had a difficult childhood, and kind of got tough as a result of that. But that toughness kind of led her to a situation where she thinks she can justify doing something that's wrong and that she knows is wrong because it's good for her and she deserves it, right? So she's, I guess she's an example of the way we can get when we know we're doing something we shouldn't be doing, but we find all kinds of reasons why, I should do this because da 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 da. I didn't get this, or this didn't happen for me, or whatever. So she definitely goes a bit overboard that way. Yeah, I admire her a lot. She's the kind of person I never have been and never would be,
Mhm.
in terms of just her guts and her courage and all of that. But of course, it just seemed more interesting to me to make her somebody who decides to do something that's wrong, for all sorts of self-justifying reasons. So the dilemma she's faced with in the book is, am I going to continue to be like this, or am I going to find that part of myself that knows this is wrong and change my ways.
Mhm. No, I think again, I might be biased, but I think Claire can do whatever she wants. Um,
Yeah,
she
yeah,
she yeah, she just
yeah.
I think I I feel like she went through so much and you really just see her try to take her power. She has power, but you really see her
Hmm.
take that power back
Hmm.
and yeah, I think she people like Claire could run the world. That's
Yeah, yeah,
that's what I
yeah.
think.
Yeah,
Um,
she's kind of based on some women writers of the past who I've always admired. One of them is Freya Stark, who was a British writer, travel writer, who in the early part of the 20th century just sort of traveled the world and went to all these places where a woman was not supposed to go, especially alone, right? And had all these incredible adventures doing things that she wasn't supposed to do as a woman at that time. And so a character in my first novel, Icefields, Freya was definitely based on her, and I have a feeling that I probably there's something of that in Claire as well, for sure.
mhm.
Yeah.
Overall, again, really strong characters between the three. And I know the way that the book is structured, the chapters are isolated to their point of view and their perspective. What was your reasoning for going with that type of structure in the book?
Well, more than anything, it was because Claire's story was originally a separate story that I was developing.
Oh.
And I was trying to complete the story of Alex and Amery, and I felt like something was missing, and I wasn't sure how, where I was going to go with that. And then I kind of, in desperation to try to figure out a way to finish this novel, I thought, what if I took Claire's story and dropped it in here with these other characters? What would happen, right? It's like sometimes as a writer, it's like you're doing chemistry experiments or something, right? If I've got these characters and this situation, what would happen if I dropped in, boom, this other character on a different trajectory and so on? And oftentimes I find that's what causes the creative spark to just, boom. It's like, oh yeah, now I see, right? The relationship between these characters. I needed Claire. I didn't know I needed her to kind of, fulfill the story of the other two characters. But once she was in there, I realized, yeah, I see now. There's a triangle here, and it's not an obvious one in the book. It's kind of a subtle one that takes place over time and history, and the characters only slowly come to see their connection with each other. But it's there. It's definitely there, and it's the thing I needed to complete the book.
Mhm. Oh, wonderful. And with what you said, just the overall writing experience, not knowing what you needed, and just kind of plopping Claire in there and having it pieced together. I wonder if that for the other books that you've published and written versus the Book of Rain, I'm curious about your overall experience with, again, having ideas kind of come to fruition and then really getting it on like a pad and paper and pen. I'm just curious more about your writing experience, just from initial ideas to really kind of combining it into one big body of work.
Sure. Yeah, when I started out as a writer, I kind of had this idea in my head that you had to have an outline about everything that was going to happen, and you had to start at the beginning of the novel and work your way to the end. And so there would be no surprises for you as the writer. You would know where you were going and you would know why. And I tried to write that way, but when I did, I ended up with these outlines of novels that were just very the plots were cliche and I was kind of bored, right? Like this, I know what's going to happen. I'm bored. So I realized as a writer, I needed to be the first reader of the book in the sense of someone who doesn't know where the story's going and who wants to find out, right? The key reason that we read books, we want to find out what's going to happen. So that's what I needed to do as a writer was to put myself in that situation as a reader and just start a story and not knowing where it's going to go. And if I needed to, I could stop for a while and write something else totally unrelated. And that might actually turn out to be, I could fit that in with what I had already. So in the end, for me, every book I've written is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, right? I've got all these pieces that I've written and I don't know what the connections are. And at a certain point, I start to take these pieces and I fit them together and find out how's this gonna fit with this? And eventually I get a storyline. I get a kind of thread of narrative that runs through all these pieces and I know, okay, now I know what the story is. And yeah, as I was saying about the Book of Rain, that's exactly what happened with Claire. She wasn't even in the same jigsaw puzzle. She was in a different jigsaw puzzle, and putting her in the other one was what kind of the key that made it click.
Very nice. Yeah, no, again, I think she could rule the world, and then no one can tell me any different. I think she can do anything.
Uh,
Another question I had,
yeah.
just because the way I dived into the book, I'm an audiobook person, and you
Okay.
are credited in your audiobook, which I know may vary for authors. So I was curious again what that experience was like for you, if that was the first audiobook you've done for a body of your work, and what that was like, again, taking that and now contributing to the a different type of entity that
Mhm.
embodies it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the first audiobook I participated in. The publisher, Random House Canada, they wanted to have, and I really like this idea. Different readers read the different sections of the book, right? So there'd be a reader for Alex, a reader for Amery, a reader for Claire. And I just thought, oh, that's terrific, right? All these different voices who are going to put a different kind of mood and atmosphere on each of these sections. And then they asked me if I'd like to read just the translator's introduction for that final part of the book. The long tale told by a bird. So I just jumped at the chance to do that because I'd never done anything like that before. And as it turned out, I was really glad that I was only reading a few paragraphs because it was exhausting. I had no idea how exhausting it is to try to read at a certain pace and clearly so that, and even so, the recording engineer, who in this case happened to be my son Connor, the publisher asked him if he'd like to record me reading my part of the book. So that was wonderful. But having to stop, go back, read something again because it wasn't quite clear. Sometimes you pronounce words in a funny way without realizing it. Why was I pronouncing that word like that? So there's a lot of work involved, and uh, yeah, I really learned respect and admiration for people who do that kind of voice work. Because, you may think it's just sitting in a chair talking to a microphone, but it's as tough work as anything else as I've ever done. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I can again especially empathize for, not to completely jump off topic, but voice actors in movies and TVs who might be playing five different characters in something that's a whole different personality in five. So yeah, it's definitely no easy task, I'm sure.
Mhm.
Just a question in the chat. Would you do it again for future works? Would you do another
Yeah,
audio?
I would love to, if something I wrote wasn't too long, I'd love to do the whole thing. I think I would anyways. But we'll see. But now that I've done it once, I definitely want to try it again. It was just like I say, just a few short paragraphs. So I was kind of only getting warmed up, and then it was like, oh, now we're done. So yeah.
Okay.
And I know
Well,
a fellow writer of mine here in Edmonton, Connor Kerr, he just had his a novel published called Prairie's Edge, um, by Penguin Canada, I think it is. And he read the whole book. So I was talking to him the other night about that and the process, and he said the same thing, it was so exhausting, brutal. Yeah.
wow. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, at least for you, it was a family affair. So I'm sure that helped, like you said, with your
Oh yeah.
son.
Yeah,
So,
that made it a little bit more kind of relaxing since I
mhm.
knew the recording engineer. Yeah.
Yeah, knowing people helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so another question I wanted to ask, and again, this just kind of leads off into what I feel is a great job that you do, painting the picture for where characters are in certain locations. Again, specifically River Meadows, and really immersing yourself in when the wobbles happen, little shifts in time and space. Um, what do you think is important with really with those moments of transitioning, really wanting the reader to really understand and setting the scene? What do you think is important with moments like that to really depict in writing?
Well, I think you want them to be kind of mysterious, right? One of the wonderful things about fiction is that it can hint at things, it can suggest, it can gesture towards something without entirely naming it. And that I wanted those moments in the book to be kind of like that, those moments when the character feels like they've stepped out of their ordinary reality and things are strange for a moment. We all have moments like that here and there. We tend to just ignore them, right, and get on with our day. Um, but I think we all live kind of interesting lives inside our heads that we don't think about all that much. The fantasies and dreams and things that we feel and experience in a day that just kind of flicker past and then they're gone. Uh, the novel and the short story are really wonderful for kind of paying attention to those moments, getting us to stop as readers and notice the tiny little things, the subtle little moments that happen in our day and in life that we may just not even have thought about before. I've always been inspired by writers who can do that kind of thing. And there's so many of them. I could name all kinds. Alice Munro is obviously a great Canadian writer who is able to kind of pinpoint these odd little moments in people's lives where they see themselves in a different way, or that something happens that shifts their sense of the world or of life. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome. I do want to dive a bit more into just, again, writing as a whole for you. So obviously a great success with the Book of Rain, as well as other works that you've had. I wonder if the success of those works creates pressure for you at all for future works that you have.
Hmm. I think maybe it did way back with my first book, right? After I wrote my first novel, I had the feeling, okay, now I know I can write a novel, but can I do it again? Right? I did it once. Could I actually do it again? That was kind of the big anxiety-making question. Was this just a one-off, or is this something I can actually do again? So, that was part of the issue of tackling the next book was what do I say? What do I write about? People are expecting me to write a certain thing. My first book was about Alberta and about the history of Jasper, but I want to write about something completely unlike that. Should I do that? Is that a good idea? Right? People are going to be expecting another Alberta book. You have all those sorts of questions as a writer. You know, anxiety making questions. Now I'm kind of I more feel like the main thing is that I should pursue whatever it is fascinating me or bothering me at the time. And, just see where it goes, go where it leads, and don't worry about all of that stuff, right? The time to worry about that is when it's done and when it's finished and you can take it to your agent or to a publisher and say, what do you think of this? Right. So yeah, that kind of issue's not such a big deal for me anymore. Um, Who knows? It may turn out to be again in future, but right now it isn't. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Right now is the most important. I also wonder, because I know before we actually hopped onto the official call, you mentioned that you recently retired from the University of Alberta, but prior you were teaching creative writing. I was curious as to if you knew that that was something you wanted to do, was teach, and also curious about what kind of core philosophies and values you try to instill in your students while you were there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I went that route because, when I started writing when I was a student in university, and I really loved my creative writing courses. I took courses with great Canadian writers like Rudy Wiebe, Christiana Gunners, Greg Hollingshead, and I kind of wanted to pursue that direction. So I was already in a kind of academic space, writing stories and novels and so on. Then I worked with Aretha Van Herk at the University of Calgary. She's a wonderful reader of fiction. And so she was able to give me all kinds of great insights about my work. It was funny though, because I was talking to her about the idea of going the academic route and becoming a teacher. And, and she said, don't become an academic. Do not become an academic. She was kind of warning me about all the work involves committees and all the rest of it. But I didn't listen to her. I went that route, and so I've taught for the last 20 years full time at the U of A, in the same program that I was a student in. So that was very interesting. I always felt like I had a better understanding of what the students were going through because I had gone through it myself as a student. So yeah, no, I've learned a lot from my own students. That's been a wonderful thing. What was the second part of your question again? It was about the students. I'm not sure if I've
So
answered.
just any kind of core philosophies or values you hope to instill in them
Oh, well,
throughout the years.
yeah, I certainly hope to instill in them, the philosophy of read, 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 read lots of books. I've noticed over the years that, uh, when I started out, the students and I could kind of share a certain number of writers who everybody had read, and we could draw upon these as examples. But as the years have gone by, uh, you know, that sort of common ground of fiction has been overwhelmed by all kinds of writing, and now the students are much more interested in television and movies and even video games, right? Often they'll say to each other, "Oh, your story reminds me about this video game that I played recently," right? So it's a whole kind of other world of narrative that oftentimes I have no clue about. And I think, whatever you want to write, if you want to write for video games, TV, movies, go back to some of the great writers of the past, the great narrative writers. Steep yourself in those works that have lasted, and they've lasted for a reason. And yeah, I think it's like 50% of the labor of being a writer is reading other people's work and learning from them.
Do you have any kind of core authors? I know you've mentioned quite a bit of people that you've worked with in the past and drawn bits of inspiration, but do you have any maybe core authors that you find have really helped shape you as the author you are today?
Yeah, well, there's some local Alberta writers. Robert Croach, was a great Alberta writer, passed away in 2011, I think it was. And he was one of the writers who showed me that I could write about the place I lived, right? I'd never thought that the place I lived was a place you would write about. It was just ordinary, right? It was just northern Alberta, central Alberta. There was, what was special about that? The stories all seemed to come from somewhere else, other places that seem to have this kind of magical story quality to them, right? Whether that's London or New York or who knows where. Um, and reading Robert Croach's work made me realize there are stories here. There are great stories here. There are great storytellers here, and they have their own voice, their own way of looking at the world. And that was a real inspiration for me in terms of working on my own stuff, is that, yeah, I can make a story world out of the place I know.
Mhm. And it also circles back to again what you said earlier, just talking about that pressure, but it's at the end of the day staying true to yourself and just with that inspiration, staying true to what you know and what you want. Because I feel that that ultimately makes your work 10 times better, but you also know it can't be any more authentic that way as well.
Yeah. And that's what, mentors and inspirational writers are great for, is that they help you ground yourself in that feeling like, yeah, somebody has gone here before me and they've done this thing. And so, I may not know where I'm going exactly, but I have their inspiration to kind of help me along, right? To know that I will get somewhere eventually with this thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
For sure. Could I ask what you are currently reading right now, if anything?
Oh, yeah, I've got stacks of books on the go. I'm reading a couple of the other writers whose books are on the Alberta Book Awards shortlist with me this year. Jessica Johns, her book Bad Cree, and Deborah Willis's book Girlfriend on Mars. So I'm currently reading those. I've Yeah, I've got probably 8 or 10 books with bookmarks in them at any given time, and I just move from one to the next. I don't know how I keep track of them all, but I just can't read one book by itself at any given time.
Mm. But again, I know this circles back to when you have different ideas and kind of back to kind of putting characters together. It seems that, again, little bits of inspiration here and there, little bits, it seems that you work best with those different outlets at the same time. If you're able to manage, it seems like you're again creative, best creative flow, which is
Yeah, I guess that yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right, right? It's maybe that's the kind of brain I have. It just jumps around from one thing to another and doesn't want to stay still at any time. And if so, well, that's what works for me, right? It's not going to work for everybody, but it's what works for me.
yeah,
Yeah, so good
absolutely.
point. Good point.
Yeah. Um, for anyone, so again, similar to the creative writing, but if you would have maybe a key bit of advice for anyone that's really looking to just get into publishing their work
Hmm.
and becoming an author, what would be at your top kind of biggest key thing that you'd hope they would
Yeah,
kind of take with them? That's a good start. And I also
yeah,
wonder what your experience is like when you were first starting. Anything you
yeah.
kind of learned that went well, didn't go well.
Hmm. I would say the most important thing that a writer starting out needs to have is perseverance, you know, because the world doesn't know who you are. They're not necessarily interested in what you have to say. That's just the way it is, right? You send out your work, it gets rejected over and over again. It can be so disheartening. And it's still, for me, it still is as a writer, right? I still am in the situation where I send something out and it gets rejected and turned down and so on and so forth. And there are days where I still wonder, why the hell do I do this, right? Nobody seems to be interested. Then there are days where things change and you do connect with somebody, you do find an audience, and that's wonderful. But it can be very difficult starting out as a writer. So I think that's one of the things that makes a writer. I was in classes with a lot of other student writers when I was a student writer. And most of them just never pursued it, right? They went on to do other things, which is fine, which is great. But they didn't pursue writing because it's a lonely kind of and sometimes depressing sort of occupation. You're talking to yourself in your head most of the time. So you have to have more than anything, I think, just the ability to just absorb the blows and keep going, because you love it, presumably, right? It's the main reason to be a writer, to do writing, is because it's something that you need to do, you love to do it. And that's certainly the case for me.
Oh, that's wonderful. And again, it's interesting to hear you say that you have moments where you're like, why am I doing this? And I think that so many people can resonate, not just in the literary world, but just in regular everyday any job, no matter how long you're in it. I think,
Mhm.
sometimes those days where you're feeling really passionate at times doesn't feel like it always cuts it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting as long as you've been in this world, to know that you have those days as
Hmm.
well. So
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a very human experience at the same time.
Absolutely. I guess especially for people in the creative realm, right? In the arts and so on. And obviously, I had a day job to keep me going too, so that's nice, right? It was that was my dad's advice years and years ago, is like, okay, you want to be a writer, that's great, but you better have something lined up as a day job, because if you have a family and you have kids, you're going to need to be able to feed them, So I never followed most of his advice in life for sure, but I definitely followed that, and I decided, yeah, teaching is probably what I should be doing of all the possible careers out there because it's so connected to the writing that I do.
Mhm. Yeah, no,
Mhm.
it's wonderful. Well, again, I know you said that you recently retired, so I'm curious now if you feel that your schedule will feel different now, like if you'll feel that you'll have more time to write, or if it'll again be getting into a new routine for you in any way.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. I marked my last student paper last week, and already it's kind of like the days are feeling a bit more spacious. So I better just watch out, right? Because the danger is that it'll be just like, oh, I've got all day. I might as well just go outside and stare at the squirrels for a while, right? You know. But yeah, maybe I owe that to myself for a little while, just to spend some time taking it easy and
Mm.
relaxing. Yeah.
So we do have questions in the chat. I'm just going to
Okay.
pull up. So the first one here, would you say it's necessary to read all the classics, or are there certain books that encompass more of what humanity is about than others? In brackets, I'm still traumatized by Lord of the Flies and Othello in the same year at high school a few decades ago.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody could read all of the classics, right? And, as time goes by, we discover more books that had been forgotten that are definitely worth reading from the past. So I think, as a reader, just kind of follow your nose, right? What interests you in those books? There's so many wonderful books from the past. And, the greatest thing that can happen is if you pick up a book and you start to read it and it just sort of takes you by surprise, maybe even shocks you and disturbs you. Um, those kinds of reading experiences can seem like, oh, this is too much for me or something, but they can be really valuable because and I think that's one of the purposes of literature, is to disturb our complacency and kind of shake us up a bit. Franz Kafka, the German writer, said that we should read books that are like an axe to the frozen sea of our souls, right? That just sort of chop away at everything that we've kind of encrusted over ourselves of habit and complacency and beliefs and so on. So the world of classic literature is a world filled with that sort of thing, So um, I don't know if I mean, I have my own sort of touchstones, I guess you could say, the books that I go back to over and over again for various reasons. Dostoevsky, the great writers. I don't write anything like him, never will, but I go back to his books because I get that sort of kick that wakes me up, right? It wakes me up from the sleep of just kind of habitual, ordinary life. Yeah.
So another question, um, even even before you come up with a book idea, do you think about the target market?
I have in the past for sure. When I decided to write uh, a YA fantasy trilogy, The Perilous Realm, when I started that out, I realized I had to think really hard about the target audience for that because it was a different one from the audience from my adult books. So, I went back to the books that I'd read when I was a kid. What did I like about them? Which were the ones that really excited me? And, I kind of modeled my procedure of writing on those sorts of books. So yeah, I don't know if I maybe didn't I may, there's things about my target audience that maybe had moved on from where I was, right? Because when I was a kid, that was a long time ago, and books were different, kids were different in some ways. So I probably could have done more research in terms of what kids were reading now as opposed to the kinds of books they were reading when I was younger. That would have helped. Yeah.
And then we just have one last comment before we wrap up for the evening. So, speaking of audiences, I'm really enjoying your Substack newsletters. I really look forward to them from a creative writing / arts energy I get from them, and also the content. As an Edmontonian, but now living in the Okanagan, please continue with them.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm just glad. I love to hear that. You know, when you're writing a Substack, it sometimes feels like you're writing into the void and you don't hear from anybody. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. It's fun.
Wonderful.
Substack is fun, right? It really feels like you're connecting to people in a way that other platforms don't let you to, don't allow you to. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we're a couple minutes away from 8 o'clock, so I think we'll be wrapping up if we can pull up the slides. But thank you, Thomas, so much. This was wonderful. It was really great to be able to pick your brain not only about the book, but just about your experience overall as a writer. And we've had some wonderful questions come into the chat as well. So
Mhm.
again, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brianna. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.